It takes a bit of time for it to start recording. I've got here it goes. Bonjour à tous, ici Paul Ponceau pour un nouveau podcast d'Au-delà de l'illusion. Et aujourd'hui, j'ai le plaisir d'avoir un invité très spécial, Jerry Marzinsky. Jerry Marzinsky est titulaire d'un diplôme en psychologie de l'Université du Temple et d'un master en thérapie de l'Université de Géorgie. Il a étudié 2 ans dans un programme de doctorat en psychologie. Avant de prendre sa retraite, c'était un praticien certifié, un psychothérapeute certifié. Il a passé 35 ans de son expérience professionnelle à travailler avec des patients schizophrènes et d'autres patients dans des hôpitaux psychiatriques et aussi dans le système pénitentiaire américain. C'est également un pilote commercial et un plongeur professionnel. Donc, c'est quelqu'un qui a énormément de cordes à son arc. Et aujourd'hui, on va parler de ce qu'il y a derrière la schizophrénie, mais plus généralement derrière les pensées intrusives. Et on va voir que ce que Jerry Marzinsky a à nous dire démontre sans l'ombre d'un doute la présence de vampires psychiques, d'entités parasites qui nous affectent dans le quotidien. Et ce qu'on peut appeler la schizophrénie, ce n'est qu'une partie de cela, c'est la partie la plus extrême de ces entités. Donc, voilà pour une interview très intéressante qui sera en anglais. Hello all of you and welcome to Au-delà de l'illusion. Today we've got as a very special guest, Jerry Marzinsky. Jerry Marzinsky is a formal academic. Jerry Marzinsky's formal academic training comprises a BA in psychology from Temple University, a master's degree in counseling from the University of Georgia, and 2 years of study in a PhD psychology program. Prior to his retirement, he was a licensed psychotherapist. He has over 35 years of experience working with schizophrenic and other psychiatric patients in state hospitals, state prisons, and hospital emergency rooms. He is also a licensed commercial pilot and scuba diver. He lives in Tucson, Arizona, and Jerry Marzinsky is going to talk about what lies beneath schizophrenia. Now, for people who have followed my research on the non-human presence, Jerry Marzinsky will really confirm through his own research what we've been saying for years and what occultists have said for years and years before us. That is, there is a non-human presence that feeds off human emotions, of human energies, and that basically affects us in our everyday life, with schizophrenia being just the top end of the spectrum. So, welcome, Jerry, to the show.
Well, thanks for having me.
So, first of all, tell us a bit how you got interested in the voice phenomenon.
Well, it started years ago when I was in undergraduate school, and what I hated about psychology was that, unlike engineering or any other discipline, you couldn't verify for yourself what they were saying. You had to take for granted that everything they were saying was true, because there's no way to get into a psych hospital or a mental health center or any kind of formal institution that held the mentally ill. You couldn't get in there. You can't just walk in the door and go, hey, I want to study this. I want to see if this is true. So here's 4 years of having to deal with, and I didn't trust authority. That was a big thing behind I mean, I never fully trusted authority. So here they were teaching all this stuff, and the first thing that hit me, I remember in undergraduate school, was a paper that a psychologist wrote that we were told to read. And basically what it said was that if two schizophrenics encountered each other with the same hallucination, you know, both of them thought they were King George, this psychologist was saying that one of them would have to give way and change his identity to some other fictional character. And I'm like, what kind of sense does that make? You know, they're two crazy guys and they both think they're King George. I mean, why would one of them have to change? It didn't make any sense. So I had no way to disprove that or prove it or anything, because like I said, they have you locked out of clinical populations. In the 40 years I've been working with psychiatric patients, I've never once seen a researcher in any of the institutions that I worked at actually looking into what was actually happening. It's like they're programmed in graduate school and they're released with these fabrications that, you know, the psychiatric mafia and psychology has put into their heads. So I logged that one in, and one day it was, you know, maybe, I don't know how many years later, maybe even as much as a decade later, I was doing rounds on one of the big psychiatric wards, and a new guy had appeared, a new patient had appeared, and you know, it was my job to kind of size up all the new psych patients that were coming on the unit, see what they were going to do, how they were reacting, you know, how they were behaving, and seeing if they needed medications. So I came up to this guy, and he was arguing with somebody. You know, he was carrying on a vehement argument, but it was like listening to one side of a telephone conversation. You know, where he was arguing with somebody, but he was arguing in full sentences, and he was upset, and he's walking around arguing with somebody, but it's like listening to one side of a telephone conversation. So I kind of crept up on him and trying to listen to what he was saying, and then he saw me, and you know, I walked up and said, "Hey, I'm Jerry. I'm the psych for this unit. You know, I haven't met you before. What's your name?" And he looks at me and he goes, "I'm Jesus Christ." You know, and I thought for a second, and then I looked him straight in the eye and I went, no, you can't be Jesus Christ, because I am. And I'm waiting for his response, you know, to see, is what they told me 10 years ago true? I mean, if two people with the same delusion encounter each other, well, one of them have to change. So is he going to change his delusion? Because I, you know, and I was adamant about it. I said, no, I am. You can't be. And he sat there and he thought for a minute, and, you know, he looked around, and then he looks at me and he goes, okay, we can both be Jesus Christ. And he strolls off. I'm like, okay, what else did they lie to me about? Yeah. You know, that was the first time. And then later I found out that 80% of what psychologists publish is not replicable. You know, so it can't be repeated. So only 20% of what they publish holds any water. And I saw when I was in graduate school that it's publish or perish. It doesn't matter what they're publishing as long as they're publishing something. You know, so that kind of dampened my trust for what they were putting out. And then it came to psychiatry. So, you know, I was working at the biggest state hospital in the world at that time. I mean, there were like 10,000 patients there when I first arrived in Milledgeville, Georgia. And one of the things I'd been told was that schizophrenics were schizophrenic because they had a chemical brain imbalance. That's what they were teaching in graduate school. And they were also teaching that they had some genetic upset, but something was wrong with their brain. I mean, their brains were broken. And there was some kind of chemical imbalance there. So they're teaching this in all institutions, and this is pushed by big pharma. You know, they want everybody to believe that. So one thing I noticed is that none of the psychiatrists, before they dished out any of their medications, took any kind of samples. They didn't take any blood work. They didn't do any kind of test. They didn't do anything to determine what the chemical balance of the brain was. And they just kind of got a dartboard and just mentally, oh, well, okay, we'll start them on this antipsychotic medication and see what happens. You know, it was like a dartboard. They are spinning a wheel. It was like, you know, based on their experience, maybe this isn't, but there was no measurement. And I'm thinking like, well, how are they going to know what's out of balance or by how much if they don't have any tests? And I looked into it and no tests exist for that. There is not a single test to verify any of the diagnoses. You know, and I think, what is it, 250 something now in the DSM-5, you know, the Bible for psychiatry. There's not a single medical lab test to verify any of those diagnoses. You know, they were all made up by psychiatrists. You know,
and the question is, what is behind that psychiatric mafia? Well, that 80% of flawed psychiatry, what is behind it? Because in my research, I've come across the Rockefeller family, I've come across eugenics, secret societies such as Nazi-linked secret societies. So in your experience, you've experienced that firsthand. What's behind that flawed psychiatry?
Well, where it started off was in the 1930s when here in the U.S., where Rockefeller and you know, Standard Oil and all these big multimillionaires kind of took over the medical schools. You know, so they bought off the U.S. Congress to make laws that the only doctors that could be licensed would practice pharmacology. There's no other treatment. All the others were outlawed. You know, the electrical therapy, the naturopathy, all the other forms of treatment were considered garbage. And the only valid form of treatment that they had enacted by law was, you know, pharmacology, treating people with drugs. So they virtually put out of business all the medical schools except for, you know, a couple of the big ones over here, making those laws that if they didn't teach pharmacology, they weren't licensed as a doctor. And the big pharma was behind this. So all the medical schools had to teach, you know, pharmacology. All the others were outlawed and made illegal. Any doctor who referred a patient to any other form of treatment was risking their license back then. And since then, big pharma and the medical industry has taken over the medical schools. So the medical schools are basically teaching what big pharma wants them to teach. You know, they're providing huge grants. They're taking money if they don't. And they're still publishing lies. They're still, if you read their advertisements, they're still saying that schizophrenia is due to a chemical brain imbalance, although they have no proof of that whatsoever. Matter of fact, it's been disproved over and over and over again. But what they want to do is sell their toxic drugs. They want no interference with their office visits. They want no interference with their sale of drugs. And between psychology or psychiatry and big pharma together, they're making $447 billion a year selling these toxic antipsychotic drugs that they put out on the market and are selling around the world. And those drugs don't cure anything. They don't cure schizophrenia. What they do is they're major tranquilizers, and they'll weaken the voices. But they, in virtually all cases, they don't get rid of them. So when the people stop taking those drugs, the voices reappear.
And what are the side effects of those drugs? Because in France, there's basically I think it's the same in the US, but there's basically about millions and millions of people that are either on antidepressant drugs or antipsychotic drugs. So what are the side effects of those drugs?
Oh, they're horrible. I have them listed here. Let me see if I can find them. You know, dry mouth, sexual dysfunction. You feel like you're. It's like a combination of being nervous and drugged down at the same time. See if I can find these things. Here it is, A2.
Of an interruption. So tell us the side effect of those drugs.
Well, the antipsychotic drugs that they're using even today, I mean, they have less side effects, but they're some of the most dangerous and toxic drugs used in medical practice today. You know? But the psychiatrists won't tell the patients that. You know, they can cause permanent, well, matter of fact, they shrink your brain, and they can cause permanent neurological damage with extended use. So where they started first finding this was with mental patients in the psych hospitals when they did autopsies. They found that their brains were shrunk, you know, and the you know, legitimate researchers would publish that, and then big pharma and the psychiatric mafia jumps up screaming, no, it's not the drugs, it's a schizophrenia doing that. You know, it's not our drugs. So some other researchers started giving these antipsychotic drugs to animals, to monkeys, and they found that their brains were shrunk and their peripheral nervous systems were rotted out also. So they proved it. So the psychiatric mafia and the big drug companies, they blocked that research, and they wouldn't publish it. They wouldn't put it out there. But these drugs should not be used on a permanent basis unless the patient is totally out of control. You know, there was no other way to control them, and that's not so with most. So what happens is the side effects, the toxic effects of these drugs. I mean, it's not, you can call them side effects, but what they are is poisonous, toxic effects of these drugs. And what they do is they cause muscle rigidity. They slow your movements. It's like your brain has got syrup on it. There's involuntary muscle jerking. There's muscle tremor. There's restlessness and a feeling as if one needs to be in constant motion. There's tardive dyskinesia, which is actually the neurological damage taking place. It's their involuntary movements of the face and the mouth and the lips and the arms and legs, and tongue darting, where your tongue darts out. There's neuroleptic malignant syndrome. It's a life-threatening condition that's characterized by muscle rigidity, fever, sweating, irregular heartbeat, blood pressure changes, altered mental status, confusion, disorientation. And these are all side effects of these crappy drugs. So dizziness, weight gain, sexual dysfunction, cardiac effects, hypotension, dry mouth, constipation, nausea, vomiting, headache. So these aren't fun drugs to take, and they're not abusable. Nobody in their right mind is going to abuse these things. You know, in Mexico, you can go to Mexico and go over the border, and you can get these drugs in the pharmacy over the counter. You know, so if you've already been prescribed them, you don't have to keep going back to the psychiatrist to get them again. Yeah, you can walk in and say, I want this, and so nobody in their right mind would take these things. You know, they're awful drugs, but psychiatry and big pharma want to keep control of that. And like I said, between psychiatry and big pharma, they're making $447 billion a year on office visits and the sale of these toxic drugs. But they're so awful, schizophrenics don't want to stay on them. You know?
And so they're efficient just when the people are really in a really psychotic in an attack phase, and then a proper psychiatrist should then wean the patient from the drugs once they're better and once they've had proper therapy.
Well, the therapies that they have right now don't work. You know, there are we know what to do. I mean, it's the voices that drive schizophrenia. You know, that's psychiatry has gone as far as to label the voices a thought disorder. But that's it. They stopped there. And then what they declared was the voices are hallucinations. So look what they've done with that proclamation. And they have no research to back that. None. Just in their infinite arrogance, they just stand up and go, yeah, the voices are hallucinations due to a broken brain because they say so. You know, there is no broken brain. You know, they have not been able to find any chemical imbalance in the brain of schizophrenics. They have not been able to find any genetic marker for schizophrenia. So all this, what they're doing is they're desperate to search for a physical cause for schizophrenia so they can keep selling drugs, you know, these toxic drugs that merely suppress the symptoms. And what's even more disastrous is that when these symptoms start to occur, they will add other drugs. So they'll tell the patient there is no cure. You got to take these awful drugs for the rest of your life. That's the only treatment there is. You know, and these are the high priest of psychiatry. So here's voices start appearing in the patient's head, and they're getting in trouble, and they're telling them to do awful things, and then they go to the psychiatrist. The psychiatrist tells them, well, your brain is broken due to a chemical imbalance, and there's nothing you can do about it except take these toxic drugs. And they're expensive. I think it's close to $800 to $1,000 a month for them to stay sane if they don't have insurance by taking these drugs.
So it's a total rip-off, and it's total destruction of the mind and body.
Well, yeah, these drugs are very, very toxic. But the thing is, they don't know what else to do. You know, and back when I was working at the hospital, the state hospital, it was like that's all they knew to do. You know, and they could keep large populations under control by drugging them silly with these things. You know, so they could reduce staff, and you know, that's kind of what they're doing now with psychiatrists on the street. You know, look at what the typical schizophrenic goes through. I mean, these voices appear in their heads that are intrusive thoughts, and they're not good. You know, they're telling them to, you know, hit people, you know, cuss people out, leave, isolate, you know, to do all these kind of antisocial things, and they're like, what's going on here? They're, you know, sometimes they start gradually, sometimes they start suddenly. But they go to a psychiatrist because they're the high priest of mental health. They've taken over the mental health system. And look what they're told. Your brain is broken. There is no cure. You must take these awful drugs for the rest of your life. And you must keep coming to me to get your prescriptions filled. You know, when your prescription runs out, you have to come back here so I can check and see that you're adjusted properly, or you need some other kind of antipsychotic. So, you know, it's a scam that way. You can't get these things over the counter here in the U.S., and I imagine you can't get them over the counter over there because the drug companies have taken care of that. You know, they want you to pay through the nose for these drugs, and they want the pharmacist involved, and they want the psychiatrist to have their cut.
Well, you see that in the US, and I think it's the same in Europe, even with the latest medical scam, basically, what's been going on for the past 2 years. And actually, some hospitals in some states of the US have been paid $20,000 or $30,000 for putting somebody on a ventilator, when in fact it's not the proper treatment in most forms. So that really shows, and it kills most of the people. So it really shows how corrupt the medical industry is. And with psychiatry, it's even worse, because then there's all the eugenics connection and all that, people that are mentally ill, or supposed to be mentally ill, or deemed by the system unworthy and all that. So they'll even be more pushed down and more destroyed than ordinary people. As ordinary, of course, just a way of saying it, but there's other people.
Yeah, and you know, I watched what happened here is they closed down all the state hospitals where psychiatric patients used to reside. So they dumped them all onto the street, and you know, the schizophrenics hate these medications. You know, that virtually at one time or another, all of them go off those medications, and then they revert back into a psychotic state. And you know, I'd wonder, well, why are they doing that? Do they want to go crazy? Do they want to, you know, do they enjoy the psychotic state? Why do they all keep going off their medications? So schizophrenia is a very self-destructive disease. It's not a disease, it's a condition. They want you to believe it's a disease.
Yeah, and it's something that actually kills people, because people think that schizophrenia just makes you mad. Well, it's terrible, but it actually kills people. I mean, I read that in your book. 1/10 of schizophrenics commit suicide, and their life expectancy is very much reduced versus the real population. So it's a condition that's deadly, that's lethal, and that's when we'll get into the voices. Also, a lot of psychiatrists who treat schizophrenic people commit suicide. That's a fact that shows that there's much more than a biological process that's involved, that there's an external factor, and that external factor is non-human. So what's your take on that?
Well, yeah, you're right. That external factor is non-human. The voices are energetic entities. They're not hallucinations. You know, they run very fixed patterns that I sent you. And if they're running fixed patterns, they can't be hallucinations. Hallucinations don't run fixed patterns. So, you know, what's psychiatry? I mean, psychiatry and psychology are both spiritually devoid. I mean, you know, they don't understand that people are spiritual beings, that we're not just physical beings, we're spiritual beings at hearts, and that these bodies are spacesuits, but the real us is a spiritual being inside this body. You know? And psychiatry is just struggling to make schizophrenia a physical disease that they can drug. You know? But it's not. The closest they've ever come was saying it was a thought disorder. Now, schizophrenics get very confused about what's going on with them. Society believes that thoughts are who you are. I mean, if you have a thought going through your head, it belongs to you. I mean, where else could it come from? But if you think a second, you step back and you look at those thoughts and you listen to those thoughts, and you're sitting there concentrating on them coming in and out of your mind. Who's the one listening? Who's the one watching? So the first misnomer is you're not your thoughts. And your thoughts are not who you are. You are the one who's listening and watching them. Now, what the schizophrenic voices do is they invade the patient's mind, and they call them intrusive thoughts. They just barge in there, and they sound just like the patient's normal thoughts. You know, that there's no change in intonation. There's no, you know, it doesn't sound different. There's no harsh, you know, there's nothing like that. They sound just like the thousands of other thoughts